Owing to some unexpected illness in our podcast committee, we'd love to play for you a couple of beloved segments that we played in the past that you might have missed. The first one will be about John Philip Sousa and his incredibly beloved song, The Stars and Stripes Forever, followed by a segment on the Women's Suffrage March of 1913 that ended in an unexpected place. Thanks again for being here with us this week. Iconic, exhilarating, inspirational. These adjectives are often used to describe The Stars and Stripes Forever by John Philip Sousa, and rightly so. Just as the U.S. flag is recognized worldwide as a symbol of freedom, this march is a musical emblem of liberty. Yet even the grandest superlative cannot quite capture the significance of this march for the nation and DAR. For the 125th anniversary of the premiere of Stars and Stripes, the DAR Magazine archives were reviewed to see what role Sousa's music played in our DAR history. Found there was a remarkable, harmonious bond between Sousa and the DAR that spans 130 years. Almost out of the gate for both Sousa's band and DAR's founding, they collaborated in a high-profile project. The 1893 World's Fair was an immense accomplishment in economic, cultural, and geopolitical terms for the United States. The Chicago DAR chapter hosted 800 guests in the renowned Women's Building. To great acclaim, I quote, Sousa's band rendered selections of patriotic music, end quote. 5 years later, the Spanish-American War erupted, and when the New York City DAR chapter organized a benefit to support America's soldiers, Sousa volunteered to perform there. Thanks to his help, DAR raised the equivalent of $55,000 in today's dollars, which helped supply the Red Cross with hospital tents and hammocks. There are more than 80 references to Sousa in our DAR archives. They reveal that the daughters had a prescient understanding of his role in the very identity of our nation. From the outset, chapters of all sizes and locales utilized his music to commemorate special events, dedicate memorials and markers, fundraise for historic preservation, and celebrate community milestones. The Stars and Stripes Forever was a DAR favorite. One article described the composition as immortal, and we would quite agree even today. Well, as the years passed, Sousa continued to support DAR's mission in meaningful ways. One was when President McKinley designated the DAR as the official U.S. representative at the 1900 Paris Exposition. Sousa performed there in marvelous fashion. The DAR magazine observed, and I quote, all Paris went crazy over his band, end quote. Also, when the Flag Day ceremonies at the 1901 Pan American Exposition were held under the auspices of the DAR, Sousa opened the program. An interesting note on this, that was also the first time DAR pages were used at any meeting in the country. Then, in 1916, Sousa dedicated a march to the DAR. His inspiration came from President Wilson's speech at DAR's 25th anniversary. Also, DAR was instrumental in organizing 1931-32 ceremonies to honor the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. An essay in DAR Magazine affectionately recounts, and I quote, John Philip Sousa was present, looking not a day older than he did 20 years ago, and led the Army Band as the bicentennial march, which he composed, was played in public for the first time, end quote. That last example is indicative of how Sousa composed and conducted at a prolific rate his entire life. Our daughters eagerly anticipated that he would lead a group of U.S. bands only a few months later in Constitution Hall. However, on March 6, 1932, he passed away. The last music he rehearsed was The Stars and Stripes Forever. The DAR's previously scheduled concert resolved itself into a memorial for the great bandmaster. In essence, our Continental Congress music program that plays each evening prior to the program is an echo of that 1932 tribute to Sousa. I don't know about you, but I think I'll be remembering that on Wednesday evening as the band plays before our illustrious opening night at Continental Congress. The patriotism shared by Sousa and DAR was bolstered by family bonds. Sousa's wife, Jane Van Middlesworth Bellis, and their daughters were dedicated DAR members. When the New York City chapter held a reception in 1949, the procession included, and I quote, a Sousa march played in memory of the late Mrs. John Philip Sousa, who was a beloved member of this chapter for many years, end quote. In 1955, the Darling Whitney chapter of Port Washington presented an award of merit to Jane Priscilla Sousa. The chapter regent remarked at the time, and I quote, "In her lifetime, Jane was sat with royalty and the great of the world, yet she has never forgotten to be proud of her country and her belief in its democratic principles. She has long held out a helping hand to many in this town and country. Our young people look up to her with admiration and affection." End quote. The youngest daughter, Helen, was equally impressive. Find a Grave Memorial states that she was active in the community, authored magazine articles about her father, and wrote lyrics for 2 of his songs and 1 of his marches. Our research reveals an element of Sousa's legacy that, to our knowledge, has not been widely acknowledged. Specifically, Sousa provided professional opportunities, encouragement, and praise for female musicians decades before women even had the vote. For instance, Grace Weston Lunt, a founding member of the Old Newbury chapter in Massachusetts, composed a song called The Harvard Volunteer March. A pretty compliment was given by Sousa when his band played it at a concert in the city, noted the DAR. The Musical Trade Review praised Miss Lunt's composition, adding that, and I quote, "This march has been played on several occasions by Sousa and is one of the best marches for the piano that is published." End quote. Sousa brought attention to another female composer named Mary Speed Mercer. He enthusiastically wrote, and I quote, "Will be delighted to number United," one of Mary Mercer's compositions, "among my selections. I consider it a masterpiece." Well, the music was described as a national hymn, with words and melody copyrighted by Miss Mercer and an orchestration written by John Philip Sousa. The song gained enough popularity that many hoped it would be adopted as the national anthem, but that honor went, of course, to the Star-Spangled Banner in 1931. We here at the DAR Today Podcast Committee looked in vain to find one recording of this song, but could not. I still hold out hope, though. Do you know a link to that song? If so, please share it in the comments. We'd love to hear it. One other quick note about Miss Mercer. She often published under the pseudonym Warren Edgecombe. We can imagine why, given the climate at the time about women in certain professions. Now, a column in the DAR Magazine in 1963 entitled Noteworthy Daughters describes yet another woman who enjoyed professional opportunities through John Philip Sousa. To quote the article here, "The National Society numbers an internationally known violinist in its membership, Caroline Thomas of the Jonathan Hatch chapter, South Chatham, Mass., whose tiny hands and small stature give no clue as to her achievements. She made her professional debut with John Philip Sousa's band and has played with numerous symphony orchestras here and abroad." End quote. A Sousa band roster from 1900 contained several women's names, including that of Caroline Thomas. As early as 1936, DAR committee members were working on the advancement of American music. The Ohio State Society played a leading role in this effort, urging their chapter regents to appoint chairmen to encourage the use of American music at chapter meetings and stimulate the use of American music in schools and the community, not advocating our own music to the exclusion of all other, but assisting it to its rightful place among the best music literature of the world. Of course, the brilliant marches by John Philip Sousa were among the recommended pieces. One of the most remarkable stories DAR published about the power of Sousa's music, and a story I particularly love, involved a cultural exchange tour behind the Iron Curtain by the Eastman Philharmonic in 1962. Director Howard Hansen hesitated to include the Stars and Stripes Forever in the performances there in Russia for fear it would be misconstrued. But Sousa's masterpiece had thrilled audiences in Europe and the Near East, so the orchestra included it in the first concert in Moscow. I quote here, "The enthusiastic Russians demanded that the Stars and Stripes be repeated, an encore to an encore." And then Dr. Hansen added, "From that point on, throughout our tour of the USSR, the fame of the march spread like wildfire. If we didn't play it by the 5th or 6th encore, members of the audience would call out something that sounded like Amerikansky March, and they were not satisfied until it had been played at least once, sometimes twice. This is cultural exchange at its best, the use of the arts for world understanding." End quote. While the archives are full of more tributes to Sousa and other citizens who support America's impressive musical heritage. In fact, a final example of how DAR will always remain connected to the Sousa family comes from the DAR Magazine, published 27 years ago in October 1997. A National Defense Chair, Elizabeth Oglesby Haw, called the Daughters to action to save Historic Congressional Cemetery, or HCC, in Virginia, as it had been placed on the list of America's most endangered historic places by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Fortunately, due to the efforts of DAR members and a number of other remarkable organizations, including the National Trust and the nonprofit association currently dedicated to HCC's preservation, the graves of Sousa, his family, and so many other notable figures in our history have been protected. In fact, the cemetery was designated as a National Historic Landmark in 2011. Of course, we all recognize that it requires constant vigilance to protect and maintain these historic sites. In November 2022, 2 chapter members from the Descendants of 76 chapter, there in D.C., were privileged to help the HCC Director of Conservation clean the Sousa Memorial and 5 headstones for Sousa and his family. We'll end today's segment with this. When asked what single piece of music he would wish to hear if he had only 24 hours to live, the archives featured a quote from Sousa's biography where he said, "My choice would be The Stars and Stripes Forever. I would meet my maker with the inspiration that grows out of its melodies and the patriotism that gives it meaning." Strides for suffrage of women cross-cutting diverse cultural backgrounds began with a new level of earnest in Washington, D.C. on the afternoon of March 3, 1913. The groundwork was laid, of course, by Alice Paul, who grew up attending suffragist meetings with her mother and whose passion for change led her to become arguably one of the most prominent activists for women during the 20th century. Inspired by Emmeline Pankhurst's radical British suffragist tactics, during which time Paul served time in prison and participated in hunger strikes, she would then return to the United States, chair the Congressional Committee of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the NAWSA, and plan the first and largest women's march of its kind, very cleverly, for the day preceding Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. This well-planned event infused this ongoing 60-year effort with renewed vigor. In just 2 months, Ms. Paul would raise funds to support a march, the expenses for which would top $14,000, covering the cost of floats, banners, speakers, and a 20-page program. The schedule for the day, besides the parade and march, included 2 major events: an allegorical pageant that would unfold on the plaza in front of the Treasury Department, and the pageant would conclude, and all would proceed to Continental Hall. Yes, DAR Memorial Continental Hall, where upon arrival the pageant cast would perform the final tableau for the entire assembled crowd. With the capital city packed for the inauguration, the Women's Suffrage Parade of March 3, 1913 would receive maximum public and media exposure. An estimated 5,000 participants were led down Pennsylvania Avenue by Grand Marshal Jane Burleson and followed by the strikingly beautiful lawyer Inez Milholland in a white cape astride a white horse. I'm sure you've seen images of this. They were joined by 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 heralds, and 24 floats representing the changing status of American women. Marchers included women and men from across the nation. Participants from countries who had already enfranchised women led the march, followed by long-standing U.S. suffragists referred to as pioneers. They were followed by working women organized by their professions, nurses, professors, actresses, farmers, homemakers, and many more. State delegations followed, and male supporters followed the states. There was much debate about whether or not Black women would be marching in the parade, but ultimately, nearly 50 Black American women participated, including women from Delaware, Illinois, Michigan, and New York, as well as Washington, D.C. It was reported that 25 young women from the Howard University marched in caps and gowns. Most of those students were members of Delta Sigma Theta sorority and marched as a group. As many were told to march at the back of the parade. Some did, but not all. The independent and brilliant Ida B. Wells, a journalist, was legendary for her anti-lynching crusade in the United States in the 1890s. I'm sure you've heard of her. She was an alumna of Rust College, formerly Shaw College, and also a founding member of the NAACP. Wells refused to march at the rear. Instead, she waited until the parade began and joined the all-white Chicago delegation as they marched by. That's where she was from. That was a group with which she should march. Don't we love that? The NAACP said at that time, and I quote, "The women all reported most courteous treatment on the part of the marshals of the parade and no worse treatment from bystanders than accorded white women," end quote. So the march progressed unabated for several blocks. However, shortly after that, crowds descended upon them, blocking their way and hurling insults. Marchers were verbally and physically assaulted, with accounts of local police echoing the sentiments of the mob rather than protecting the participants. Cavalry from Fort Myer was called in to control the crowd. Ambulances were dispatched, yet, although their formation narrowed, the marchers carried on. The participants reached the Treasury building much later than anticipated, yet the approximately 100 women and children who performed the planned allegorical tableau were described by the New York Times as creating, quote, "one of the most impressively beautiful spectacles ever staged in this country." Finally, the actors joined the marchers, progressing to Continental Hall, arriving exhausted, dirty, cold, unnerved, and frustrated. Sources described Alice Paul, still in her academic robes she wore for the march, as recognizing the best situation possible was ultimately the one that unfolded that day. A peaceful parade could have captured media headlines for a day, yet the near riot that occurred would keep the suffrage movement front and center for weeks on end, signaling the start of the final round in the long fight toward achieving the vote for women and setting the precedent for thousands of political marchers to follow. Regarding the parade ending at our own Memorial Continental Hall, while there are no records in our archives that this was planned, accounts of the time tell us that this happened. How special that they recognize the importance of this monument of the American Revolution built by women. Opinions among DAR members were mixed on the subject of votes for women, interestingly. But what a spectacle that must have been, seeing these women end their historic march there on the steps. The next time you're at our House Beautiful, be sure to take a moment to reflect and imagine what this must have been like on that faithful day in March 1913. We leave you today with this quote by Benjamin Franklin. "The Constitution only gives people the right to pursue happiness. You have to catch it yourself." Well, thanks for listening, and be well, dear friends. Let's celebrate the stars and stripes forever, and remember, with all of your ancestors behind you, you are the result of the love of thousands. This podcast is written and produced by our incredible team of writers and editors, and we are, as always, so grateful for President General Pamela Edwards Rouse Wright and Historian General Suzanne Heskey for their constant guidance. The National Society Daughters of the American Revolution is a nonprofit, non-political, volunteer women's service organization dedicated to preserving our American history, securing the nation's future through better education, and promoting American patriotism. Members are all lineal descendants of those who supported the cause of independence in the Revolutionary War. For more information, please visit dar.org. This is the DAR Today podcast.